On my first encounter, my first meeting with Sheila, painter-sculptor, we became involved, not unexpectedly, in a conversation about art. And at some point I asked her, of all artists, past, present, who are the ones for whom she had the greatest amount of respect? Her answer was immediate: David Salle. Several years later, we had the good fortune, of course, to meet David, and by then it had become clear to me that there was not a corner of the art world, curators, critics, collectors, and most importantly, fellow artists, who did not share Sheila's view of David's work. Now, decades later, sitting here, all of us, one can say, we as artists can say definitively that he is, without question, one of the greatest and will remain one of the greatest artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. You cannot go through a museum, through the Chelsea galleries, pick up the art section of the newspaper, and not encounter the reverberations of David's work, his influence. That influence has now extended, not unlike our own Hans Hofmann, through the written word, into the written word, and that written word, in David's case, you can find in many periodicals, most notably the New York Review of Books, and most recently, the very book that is sitting and just released on the table back there. David has been good enough to agree to sign those books at the end of his talk. David, thank you. I thank you. This community of artists, thank you. And I'm glad to have you as part of us.
Thank you, Michael. That was indeed the art of hyperbole, but can everyone hear? Yes? And see well enough? All right, so this is actually not meant to be a talk about my work at all. We can segue to that if that interests anyone. If what I'm here to talk about turns out not to be of interest. But I thought that I'm really here to talk about how to talk about art, how to write about it, should anyone care to. But what writing about it really implies is simply how to think about it, how to describe it, how to talk about it. So that's what we're going to talk about, at least at first. I do think that how we talk about art matters. I think that it's not such a mystery or a provocative thing to say. How you talk about anything conditions how you find yourself thinking about it, and how you talk about it to yourself, of course, conditions what you do when you're making art or even just looking at someone else's art. So I do think it matters, and I think that certain habits of speech and habits of mind that they are that they indicate can take one in a more or less fruitful direction. So I think it's important to pay attention to what those conventions are, if they're serving us well or not so well. If you put any artist I've ever met anywhere in the world and take them to a bar and buy them a couple of beers, the conversation will always turn to one of two or three things: real estate. How the hell am I going to get a studio big enough to work in? And the second one, I can't remember what it is, but the third one is always, why are the critics so awful? Why are the critics so bad? Why is criticism so dreary? And even if it's not dreary, beside the point. Why does it seem that criticism is a parallel universe and we're not quite sure who inhabits that other universe, but it certainly isn't us. So I think these are fairly kind of universal concerns. Even among people who do write about art, they wonder how come it's so difficult or so rare. So what kind of criticism are we looking for? What is it, what would we like it to do? I personally am interested in criticism which has personality and is engaged in thinking about personality as a real force in the world, and personality that has an aesthetic equivalent. So when people talk about art, what we're really talking about is matters of behavior, really. So the kind of criticism, just for an example of the kind that I find useful, is I can offer the example of Tolstoy and Chekhov. You probably all know this, that Tolstoy, although pretty much a fan of Chekhov's stories, was not a fan of his plays, oddly enough. And Tolstoy had his own opinions. He told the younger writer that as a dramatist, you're almost as bad as Shakespeare. So now, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's better than true, because it reveals something about both Tolstoy and Chekhov and Shakespeare, and sets loose into the atmosphere a whole set of questions about what are our expectations vis-a-vis those things. When I first moved to New York after doing my time at art school in California, there were still in existence art bars. There might still be some now, but I don't really know of any. But in the 70s, the institution of the art bar, which was very much part of the artist's education, they were still alive. And so I remember going to some art bars. I knew a couple of older artists because they'd been visiting artists at my school. I knew them well enough to have a beer with them. I remember going to one of Mickey Ruskin's bars and seeing this guy I knew slightly, David Dahl, who since became a good friend. You probably know his work. And David he's a very articulate fellow. And we were sitting there having a beer, and this other artist comes in who I recognized as someone who was having a kind of celebrated show of abstract paintings that just opened the week before. And the guy comes over and says hello to David, and David introduces me, and he sits down, and David turns to the guy and says, not with any malice, but let's face it, not with a lot of love either, says to the guy, I'm really tired of that feeling of moist, hot air coming out from behind your paintings. Right? So, pretty, take that. And the other painter kind of came back with another kind of equally cutting insult to David, and so it went. And at the time I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. These guys are really actively insulting each other, and not for laughs, but because they are taking a position. It's not leading to fisticuffs, although you could imagine in an earlier generation that might have been the outcome. The point I'm making is that intensity of reaction seems to have died off. Now it's like, oh, I hear your show is a big success, or congratulations, or isn't that lovely, or I hate you, but I would never say that I hate you, or I'm jealous, but I would never say that. I'm talking about aesthetics having such a, being considered as such consequence that people sacrificed their feelings, and in some cases their friendship, in order to make their reactions and their attitudes clear and their position clear. The first time I met Richard Serra, I was just starting to sort of become known in the art world. Richard, not known for the milk of human kindness to begin with, he said to me, "Oh, Sally, I know all about you. You're just trying to combine Warhol with Jackson Pollock." And I just said, like, oh, fuck you, Richard, you can't tell me what to do. And then I thought about it. Later I thought, well, that was brilliant. That actually was, you know, very interesting thing to say. But the point is, he had thought about it in actual aesthetic terms, you know, not just, you know, get out of here, kid. But he had something to say, he had a statement. So when I first started to think seriously about writing, my impulse grew out of, I'm going to close this and hope that it still works when I have to open it. The impulse grew out of a feeling of disconnect between what I thought about things, how my reactions to things, and the way people talked about them in the press and the official art press and in the press release language and so on and so forth. And we've all had that experience of something being lauded in the New York Times, and then you think, well, we didn't see the same show. That's not the show I saw, or vice versa. And that's part of being an artist. That's part and parcel of you know, being in the art world. However, that natural schism started to get wider and wider and wider, to the point where the schism itself became the subject. There's no congruence between what artists think about things and feel about things and how they're described. And I realized what is causing this disconnect. I think it has to do with something which might have had a positive, you know, kind of origin, which is an overemphasis on the idea of the artist's intention, that the artist, as if the artist's intention is the defining quality of the work itself, instead of merely the starting point, or in some cases, an afterthought. So, I don't know about this school, but in most art schools, many art schools across the land, because, I mean, I'm sure the League is quite uniquely not like this, but in other schools where technique is not a focus, since technique is not being taught, what are you going to teach if you're not going to teach technique? Well, you can get people to talk about what their intention is. And people say, well, this is a work about, and then you fill in the blank, whatever the blank is. And it doesn't matter what you use to fill the blank in with, as long as you fill it in with something. So if you say, I don't know, or I'd rather not talk about it, that is not considered to be sufficient. I was doing a guest critic stint at NYU some years ago, which was kind of interesting because the woman who was the head of the department, I think she still is, had been a student of mine at the University of Hartford many years ago, I mean, a long time ago. So I thought, oh, we have something in common, the same wavelength, whatnot, and we were friends. And I made the rounds of people's studios, and everything was whatever. However, there was one young woman who just floored me. As soon as I walked into her studio, I knew I was in the presence of something rare and you know, deep, and I didn't really know what I was looking at or where it was coming from. And then the woman herself was virtually catatonic. She sat on the floor and sort of turned her head away like that and gave mumbled one-word answers to questions. And I said, okay, fine, I'll see you later. And as I was leaving, my friend, my former student, who was, asked me, well, how did it go? And anybody good? I said, well, there was one girl who I thought was just, I can't stop thinking about her. And I described her work, and the woman who was the head of the department said, oh, I hate her work. We all hate her here. And then I said, I did some investigating. Apparently, she had actively tried to prevent visiting critics from going to this girl's studio. That's how, kind of visceral her antipathy was. And I said, really? What do you hate about it? I thought it was terrific. And the answer was, she refuses to talk about the content. To which I said, what the hell do you care? Right. Maybe it's none of your business. I mean, just help her make the drawings better. But it was, okay, that's the divide in practical application. So if we're not going to talk about, if we're not going to, that's that we can't talk about it, but if we're not going to privilege intentionality, well, what can we talk about? Well, I would say, and it's just my opinion, that visual art, as any form of human communication, and probably other species as well, has a syntax and a grammar, essentially rules that govern its communicativeness. But decoding those rules, that grammar, is a matter of attention and practice. And it's something that one does not absorb the way you absorb the rules of grammar that govern speech. The way you don't have to think about it. You just, they're there. The understanding the syntax of visual expression requires practice. And it's hard to even know where to go to get the practice. But my approach is based on the assumption that a work of art is more than just a collection of cultural signs. That reading cultural signs may be as second nature as English syntax, if you're an English speaker. But this is something beyond or underneath the mere cultural signage. I mean, we're all pretty adept, we meaning, contemporary people, pretty adept at reading cultural signs. It's fun, it's the basis of a lot of humor, it's one way that we let each other know that we're sort of on the same team and so forth, and all that's well and good, but still not the same thing as looking at a pictorial event and assessing, is it authentic or not? Does it strike us as authentic? Which after all is kind of the question. So where do we look for a clue to how to go about this? And I say in my introduction to my book, I lean heavily on a kind of forebearer, a painter who was also a critic, wonderful writer of great concrete style, named Fairfield Porter. You probably all know his work. He was a wonderful realist painter. He lived in Southampton, New York, and many scenes of the landscape in different seasons, changing landscape, incredibly penetrating portraits of mostly of his family. But Fairfield Porter, in addition to being a very, very good painter, was an excellent critic and someone who you can read today, even though his heyday was in the 50s and 60s. So you were reading about shows that are so long in the past. Many of the artists he's writing about are people, the names don't even ring a bell. But it doesn't matter. The way he writes about things is highly instructive. So Porter, who I never met, he died before I was on the scene, but I know people who knew him rather well. Apparently he was a very brusque guy, apparently the kind of guy who would call you up and say what he had to say to you on the phone, then just hang up the phone. But I only say that because what I'm about to say sounds funny in that context. But this is Porter. This is a quote. Fairfield Porter wrote that a genuine and ordinary reaction to a work, like one's first impression on meeting a new person, is usually very much to the point. So let's think about that. It seems so simple and elementary as to be meaningless, but think about it. That one's first impression on meeting a new person, we all know, we have the ability, animals have the ability to know within seconds, that person for me, not so much. Well, that person's interesting, I'd like to get to know them. Probably not my thing. How do we know? I'm not saying it's infallible, but that's not the point. The point is it's there, the process is there, and we all do it. We all make use of it, I should say. So Porter, in a kind of brilliant leap of critical thinking, links that ordinary, everyday, and crucial criticality that we all walk around with, and extends that to our relationship to visual phenomena, visual culture. And he says, it's not that different. We all have a kind of first impression of something. And just as we're taught, some of us anyway, are taught not to utter our first impression on meeting someone, because that would make the other person unhappy. We're taught to bury that first impression when it comes to pictures. No, that can't be right. I better read what the wall label says, because my first impression is probably, it's just me, and after all, who am I? So, those first impressions which are very evanescent to begin with, they just kind of evaporate like champagne bubbles. And then we're left with the wall label, and then that's where the trouble begins. So, I was reminded, there's a painter named Matt Connors, who you might know his work. He makes monochromatic paintings. They're fairly glamorous. He's quite a good colorist. Not my favorite painter of the under 30 set, but he's certainly a credible artist. Well, apparently I hadn't remembered this at all, but I met him recently at an opening. He reminded me that I had been to his studio when he was a student at Yale, in the graduate program at Yale, and he said, "Oh, your studio visit just gutted me." And he said, but it was also the best visit I had of any of the visiting critics. I said, really, what did I do? I'm usually so nice. Well, apparently not always. He said, you walked in, and you walked in within 30 seconds. You went around the room and you said, boring, 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 boring. And then you left. I don't remember that, but anyway, that's what he remembered. And he said, well, that was very helpful, very instructive. Because, for better or for worse, it was an unvarnished reaction. And it's the kind of thing that you don't often get in school, because the school has a vested interest in sort of bringing you along. And why would you say that to someone when, maybe you can, nurture them a little bit. But, when you're a visiting critic, you don't have to nurture anybody. You can just react. So, anyway, he said it was helpful. So anyway, I think, to repeat myself, this idea that the artist's intention, as if the art is somehow a social studies project. My intention is to illustrate the socioeconomic plight of the. That's as an idea, that's certainly valid. But the question is, how do you make that manifest? Do you just point to it, or is it more complicated than that? And sometimes I think that in the critical discourse, pointing to the thing, as long as you can get three people to agree that pointing is adequate, then it becomes adequate. And I think it's very healthy sometimes to shrug and say, well, I'm not so sure. So, again, to go back to the Fairfield Porter directive, what is it that we do when we are being animals and assessing other animals? It happens so fast. But what we're really doing is we're paying very close attention to specific behaviors, specific inflection, tone of voice, specific tilt of the head. It's because everybody looks more or less the same two eyes, two noses, etc. A nose. But it's the specificity that registers. And it's the specificity which allows us to perceive uniqueness and then from that uniqueness generate a reaction. I would say that I'm leery of any rules in art because the fact that it's art it will always break whatever rules there are. However, one which I've never experienced being broken is that generalities are the enemy of art. And as soon as you find a critic or yourself generalizing about something, just turn it off. It doesn't help. All that helps is specificity of description, even if it becomes tedious, which it certainly can. So the specificity of something in all of its particulars, I'm looking at this painting here because it's in my line of vision, has a lot of things going on in it, and each one of those things has a specific inflection, and it would take a while to unpack the whole painting. But anyway, the way that translates into writing about art, people have asked me something, if you don't like the critics in the art forum, then who are the models for the kind of writing that you're trying to do? And I'm not saying that I have achieved it, but just as a matter of style, the models for art writing, I think, a more useful model might be sports writing. But what is sports writing, after all? Sports writing is the following. You're not there. You didn't go to the game. Or if you went to the game, two things. Either you weren't at the game, you want someone to tell you what happened at the game, or you went to the game and you want someone to tell you what you felt when you were at the game. So, and the way sports writing works is to put the reader in the middle of the game. It's the seventh inning, whatever, you know how the drill. It puts you, the reader, in the middle of the action. Sports is all about action. Well, sports is really all about drama. I mean, the reason that sports can be written about is not because there's a score. It's because it's a drama. Somebody loses, somebody wins. It used to be called the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. It's a classical dramatic structure that can be written about. Now, it's a little bit of a stretch to say, well, painting is the same thing. And we certainly don't want to go back to the old days of abstract expressionism when people over-valorized their efforts as if they were, doing more than they were in fact doing. However, it's not so much that we're on the playing field with the artist as it is that the painting, to use shorthand for any visual phenomenon, the painting is the playing field. And now we're on the playing field with the painting, and we're going to have a drama or a dance or some sort of interaction with the painting. And I can't think of very many art critics who do this. The one who used to do it very effectively, and who also, as a matter of fact, as a point of interest, who consciously modeled his style on sports writing was Peter Schjeldahl. And you can still pick up elements of that in his style to this day. Making sense so far? Yes? No? A little bit? Okay. All right, so I'm going to just read you some examples of stuff I've written about various artists. I don't know whether you'll know every artist. You probably know most of them, if not all of them. Before that, there's one other little digression. This is a little digressive, but we made an analogy between art and sports. Now to make an analogy between art and literature. Of course, it's much easier to write about writing than it is to write about art, because writing is linguistic. So there's just more traction in writing about it. but I still think it's worth thinking about, excuse me, thinking about literary criticism as a model for art criticism. And I do think that one of the things that gets confusing, certainly when you study art history, is what is the relationship between past and present? What is the relationship between the references, the supposed references to art of the past, and what we're doing today? Because one of the ways in which people engage in that, the reading of cultural signage, is to say, oh, I understand that work. That's referencing, blah blah blah, whatever the 3 artists or 4 artists whose work that sort of resembles, and sometimes it's in lockstep. In the curatorial world, in the exhibition making world, that reading of past art and linkages and genealogy takes the form of generations, mediums, or content. So that there'll be group shows, for example. Just think about life as a group show. Okay, life is a group show, right? What's the topic? What's the title? 40 under 40, or 30 under 30, or young artists from Canada, young artists from not Canada. That it's geographic, it's generational, it's medium specific, or it's protest. Fine, all boring, essentially, all without any real inside juice. They're just stuff, lists of stuff. It's like TV shows that are about cop shows versus it's lists of stuff. Fine, but absolutely useless in terms of understanding what any individual artist is up to. So I'm using as a kind of analogy to that problem an essay that Milan Kundera published some years ago in the New Yorker, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. A very provocative essay that was a long, digressive thing, essentially about why, he's born in Prague, why he did not like to be called an Eastern European writer. Is that for me? Bless you, thank you. He said, why should it be assumed that I'm carrying on a tradition that begins with Kafka just because I was born in Prague? And then he kind of rails against this tone-deaf equivalency and urges the reader to consider that that any author is engaged in, or manifests sympathetic resonances with the world of literature across and in defiance of any academic categories. So I'm going to quote. These are long, long quotes from Kundera. But he's talking about how the writer's imagination isn't linear. You don't think about the people who came just before you. You might think about the people who came 100 years before you, or 200 years before you, and you don't think about the people who were writing in the same town as you. You might think about people who are on the other side of the globe, because your work is the work. The accident of geography or generation is just, some level, a kind of accident. So he says, it was to Rabelais that Lawrence Sterne was reacting, and it was to Sterne, and it was Sterne who set up Diderot. It was from Cervantes that Fielding drew inspiration, and it was against Fielding that Stendhal measured himself. It was Flaubert's tradition that lived on in Joyce, and it was his reflection on Joyce that Hermann Brock brought to his own poetics of the novel. And it was Kafka who showed Garcia Marquez the possibility of departing from tradition. And he goes on to say, and yet Rabelais, ever undervalued by his compatriots, as tends to be the case, was never better understood than by the Russians. And Dostoevsky, the Russian, was never better understood than by a Frenchman, Gide, and Ibsen was never better understood than by an Irishman, Shaw, and so on and so forth. Said the universal importance of the generation of the great North Americans, our writers, Hemingway, Faulkner, Dos Passos, was first brought to light by the French. So Kundera sums up Dos Passos geographic distance sets the observer back from the local context and allows him to embrace the large context of world literature, the only approach that can bring out a novel's aesthetic value. That is to say, the previously unseen aspects of existence that this particular novel has managed to make clear. So what's radical about this is Kundera is embracing something which younger writers, younger critics might dismiss as something that simply doesn't exist at all. He's embracing aesthetic values as a real thing in the world that exists and can be measured and tracked across generations and across continents. I happen to agree with Kundera. I mean, one might, and many people violently disagree, but there we are. Any questions so far? Okay. So now I'm going to read you some stuff. As if the worst thing to do when you give a talk is to read quotes, but you know, I learned from my writer friends that they have it easy. They just stand up in front of people and they just read from their book, and then after an hour they're done. Say thank you for coming. So, but anyway, if you have it, and I'm not trying to promote the book, but anyway, it feels like, well, let's give some concrete examples of what you're talking about. So these are quotes from How to See, and these are random, pulled randomly from the book. Do you know Amy Sillman's work? Yes? Okay. So on Amy Sillman. Amy Sillman's pictures are solidly built, like a ship that's been reconfigured and repainted but still retains all the original rivets and portholes. These paintings are built not for speed but for durability on the long voyage. On Sigmar Polke, you all know Sigmar Polke, right? Polke's art is formally advanced, humanistic in a vaguely cynical way, and often hilarious. You can feel that he loves humanity so long as it doesn't impinge on his freedom of movement. You sometimes get the feeling he took painting apart with a screwdriver, looked at the pieces, and got bored before he could put the pieces back together. On Robert Gerber, you know Bob Gober's work, the sculptor. The elegant and elegiac sculptor Robert Gerber is the poet of drains. The theme of Gerber's work is men, their torments, desires, shames, and failures, as well as their occasional tattered triumphs, which are usually heralded by a maternal or celestial female image. As I read it, his work is about the retreat or defeat of the father, the remains of which, or whom, are seen only from the waist down, often on their faces, candles lit in memoriam. On Dana Schutz, probably all know her work from the brouhaha at the Whitney Biennial a couple of years ago. Dana Schutz, remember talent? A person who is said to have talent can do something. It's often physical, like throwing a football or playing the cello. Then there is imagination. The difference between it and talent is often misunderstood. Imagination fuels talent and funnels into it, but on its own lacks body. Today, talent is easily confused with knowingness or a desire for attention, and what passes for imagination is often nothing more than a reshuffling of cultural signs. That's fashion. Let's find a good one here. I wrote a long essay called Old Guy's Painting, which compared and contrasted three painters, Alex Katz, George Boslitz, and Malcolm Morley. Morley just passed away over the summer. And it's in the book. It's worth reading. It's because I really try to describe each one's work vis-a-vis itself, but also relative to each other. So this is one little piece about Boslitz. More than any other painter, Boslitz works like a boxer. He makes you lean in, but the next instant keeps you at arm's length. You get in too close and you could take one on the chin. There is in his work an internal sense of when to start and when to stop, when to introduce a new color, a bigger scale of mark, when to insist and when to leave off insisting, when to feint and when to jab, Whereas Katz's work, Alex Katz, whereas Katz's work is like being roughed up by a cloud, Baselitz aims to bruise. And then on more contemporary artists, on Jeff Koons, all major art expresses something true about the society in which it was produced. I happen to believe that's true, by the way. If abstract painting expresses the idea you are what you do, and pop art expresses you are what you like, then Koons's art says you are what other people like. And we could take some questions now. Let that sink in. Yeah.